All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're going deep, really deep, into one of those big questions that keeps philosophers up at night. Personal identity.
Yeah, the really big ones.
What are we really like at our core, and what makes, you from yesterday the same you as today?
Right, like what makes us the same person over time.
Exactly. And today we're going to dive into a specific perspective on this. Animalism.
Okay, so animalism, at its most basic, says each of us is simply our biological organism.
We are animals.
Right. Human animals specifically, members of Homo sapiens, and our persistence, how we continue to exist as the same person over time. It's all about that organism continuing.
So I'm an animal.
In a nutshell, yeah.
Okay, but I think for a lot of people, especially those who've, read a bit of philosophy, this might seem kind of obvious. Like, duh, of course we're animals, so what's the big deal? Why is this even a point of contention?
Well, it's actually more controversial than you might think. It goes against a lot of very common, very influential ideas about personal identity.
Like the focus on sort of psychological continuity.
Right, exactly. So neo-Lockeanism, as it's often called, puts a lot of emphasis on memories, beliefs, experiences, that kind of thing.
So who are the main players here? Who are the big names associated with animalism?
Well, on the animalism side, you've got folks like Ayers, Carter, Olson, he's a big one, Snowden, and Van Inwagen. They've really developed and defended this view.
And on the sort of opposing team?
Yeah, so those who really push back against it, you've got some heavy hitters too. Baker, Johnston, McMahon. He's done a lot of work on the implications for personal identity, Parfit, of course, and Sidney Shoemaker. So this isn't some fringe idea. It's right in the middle of a very active philosophical debate.
Okay, so that's why we're diving into this.
Exactly. We want to unpack all of this for you.
Hmm.
What animalism is really all about, the arguments for and against it, and why it's such a challenge to how we usually think about ourselves.
Sounds like a plan. So to start off, can we just lay out, like, the absolute basics? What does animalism actually say?
Sure. There are really two main parts to it. The first is about our fundamental nature, like what kind of thing are we at our core?
And the second?
The second part focuses on persistence. What does it take for the animal that is you to continue being you over time? What are the conditions for your continued existence?
Okay, got it. Let's tackle the first part then. Our fundamental nature. What's the core claim here?
Simply put, we are animals.
Okay, we are animals, but what does that actually mean?
Well, and this is where it gets a little tricky. We have to be very careful about what this claim does and doesn't entail.
Right, because I can already imagine a bunch of different ways to interpret that statement.
Exactly. So, first of all, animalism doesn't say that all persons are animals.
Okay, so there could be, like, I don't know, some kind of alien or a super advanced robot that we would consider a person, but wouldn't be an animal.
Right, that's a possibility. Animalism leaves open. And it also doesn't say that every human animal is a person.
Like, I guess a fetus or someone in a vegetative state.
Exactly. Those would be, like, biologically speaking, human animals, but they might not meet certain criteria for personhood.
So this claim is specifically about human persons. Not just any person, not every human, but human persons.
Right. And another thing is that we are animals. That doesn't mean, constitution.
Constitution. What do you mean by that?
So, a statue is constituted by marble. The statue and the marble, those are two different things, even though they occupy the same space at the same time. But that's not what animalism is saying.
We're not, made up of some other kind of thing.
Right. We're not constituted by something else. We're not like a soul inhabiting an animal body either.
Okay. So we are the animal, not just something riding around in it. Got it.
Exactly. We are numerically identical to our biological organism.
Okay. Numerical identity, that's a philosophical term. So animals here, that specifically means biological organisms, specifically Homo sapiens, right?
Yeah, human animals. Though, interestingly, some critics of animalism want to make a distinction between animals and organisms.
Why is that?
They say that organism is this purely biological term, while animal might suggest things like sentience or consciousness, and they don't think those necessarily mean you're a person.
Interesting. So to put this all together in a really concise way, for any X, if X is a human person, then X is also an animal.
Yes, necessarily. Or to use, the fancy philosophical notation box, for all X, if X is a human person, then X is an animal.
Okay, so we are animals, not constituted by anything else, just straight up animals. But how does animalism fit into the broader landscape of, philosophical views on what we are? Like, what are some of the other options on the table?
Oh, there are a ton.
Yeah.
One of the big ones historically is dualism.
Dualism, like mind and body, are separate.
Right, we're fundamentally an immaterial soul or ego, and that's distinct from our physical body. Descartes is the classic example, and more recently you have folks like Foster defending this kind of view.
Okay, what else?
Then you have those who go in the complete opposite direction and say we are nothing but our material bodies. Thompson and Williams are associated with this sort of physicalism.
So no soul, no mind separate from the body, just the physical stuff.
Exactly. Then there are those who try to combine the two, like Swinburne, who says we are a composite, a body and a soul united.
Okay, that's 3 options so far. What else?
Then there's the bundle theory, which is pretty wild. It says we're nothing more than a bundle of mental states.
So like a collection of thoughts and perceptions and memories, constantly changing.
Yep, a bundle of experiences always in flux. Hume is the classic advocate for this, and more recently you have Rovain and Campbell. Then you have some who argue for a kind of atomism of the self.
Atomism, like we're indivisible.
Right, they were fundamentally these material simples. You can't break us down any further. Chisholm and Lowe are associated with this view. Then there are those who zero in on a specific part of the body, usually the brain, and say, that's you, you're your brain, or at least some specific part of it. You see this in Puccetti and McMahon's work.
Okay, so that's dualism, physicalism, a combo of the two, bundle theory, atomism, and brain-based views. And animalism is saying, nope, none of the above. We are just animals, through and through.
Yep, pretty much. And we haven't even touched on those who say, well, persons are materially constituted by animals, but they're not the same thing.
Yeah.
Like, we're made of the same stuff, we occupy the same space, but we're not numerically identical.
Right, so it's more like the statue and marble thing again.
Exactly. Sidney Shoemaker, Baker, and Johnston fall into this camp. Oh, and then there's a really radical view that, strictly speaking, nothing persists over time.
So, like, there is no you from yesterday.
Right, that's Unger's view. No self, no persistence. So as you can see, animalism has a lot of competition in this debate about what we are.
It's a crowded field. Okay, one more clarification before we move on. I've heard the phrase, we are essentially animals. What does that mean?
That's an important addition. Yeah. It means that we couldn't exist except as animals. So our animality isn't just an accidental property. It's like baked into our very being.
So it's not like I could have existed as a disembodied spirit or something.
Right. Animalism says no. You are fundamentally, essentially, an animal. And most philosophers actually agree that all animals, humans or not, are essentially animals in this sense. So if you buy the first claim that we are animals, this essentially part usually comes along for the ride.
Okay, got it. So that's the first half of animalism, the part about our fundamental nature. Now let's move on to the second part. Persistence. What does it take for me, the animal, to persist over time? What does it take for the you of today to be the same as the you of yesterday?
Well, the animalist answer is that whatever makes an animal persist, that's what makes you persist.
So, like, if my animal body keeps going, I keep going?
Yeah, basically. But here's where it gets a little tricky again. There are actually 2 main camps within animalism about what exactly constitutes the persistence of an animal.
Oh, so animalism itself has some internal debates.
It does. And they're pretty important. So the first camp is called organic animalism. And they say that remaining alive is both necessary and sufficient for an animal to persist.
So, like, as long as my heart is beating and my lungs are working and my cells are doing their thing, I'm still me.
Exactly. It's all about those biological processes like metabolism, breathing, all the stuff that keeps us alive. And death, the permanent end to these processes, that's also the end of the animal.
And I guess the end of the person, too, according to this view.
Right. Olson and Van Inwagen, they're the big names associated with this view.
So for them, once those biological functions stop, it's game over.
Game over.
Yeah.
But then you have the second camp, somatic animalism. And they disagree that being alive is absolutely necessary for the animal to persist.
Really? So they think you can be an animal and be dead?
Well, kind of. They say what matters is that enough of the animal's structure, like its physical organization, remains intact, the structure that arose through its natural biological development.
So it's not so much about the ongoing processes, but about the underlying form, the way it's all put together.
Right. So even after biological death, if enough of that structure persists, the organism, and thus you, could still exist.
So you could be like a dead animal, but still be around in some sense.
That's the idea. Ayers and Mackey, they're the main proponents of this view.
Wow. So that's a pretty different view of death and what it means for our continued existence.
It is. For organic animalists, the moment those vital functions permanently cease, that's it. But for somatic analysts, there's potentially a bit more leeway. It all comes down to what they see as the essential aspect of an animal's identity. Is it the biological processes, or is it the underlying structure?
And this has implications for other tricky cases like unborn fetuses or people in suspended animation, right?
Absolutely. This internal debate within animalism shows that it's not just one simple, straightforward theory. There are nuances and complexities to how they understand what an animal is and how it persists.
Okay, so that's a good overview of the different versions of animalism. But now, to really understand why animalism is causing such a stir in philosophy, we need to go back in time a bit and look at one of the most influential figures in the whole debate about personal identity, John Locke.
Yeah, Locke is unavoidable here. His ideas about personal identity, especially his distinction between man and person, are super important for understanding how we got to where we are today.
Okay, so who's the man and who's the person for Locke?
Well, for Locke, man is what we would call a human animal. It's the biological organism, the body.
Okay, so the man is the physical being. What about person?
Person is different. He defines it as a thinking, intelligent being that has reason and reflection and can consider itself as itself the same thinking thing in different times and places. And he goes on to say that this is done through consciousness, which is inseparable from thinking.
So to be a man is just about your biological makeup, but to be a person, you need more than that. You need this capacity for thought, self-awareness, reasoning.
Right, exactly. And Locke illustrates this with a really interesting thought experiment. He talks about a parrot. Imagine a parrot that could actually reason and reflect.
A really smart parrot.
Yeah. But even if it could do all that, Locke says, we still wouldn't consider it a man. It's not the same kind of being as a human. On the other hand, imagine something that looks human, but it has no capacity for reason or self-consciousness.
Like I don't know, some kind of like biological automaton.
Right. Locke says we would still call that thing a man. So the point is, the criteria for identity, for what makes something the same over time, those are tied to the kind of thing we're talking about.
So what makes one man the same man over time is different from what makes one person the same person over time.
Exactly. And for Locke, what makes the same human animal persist is the continuation of biological life. But what makes a person the same person is the continuity of consciousness over time.
Okay, so that's the distinction. But why was this so important for Locke? Why did he make such a big deal out of this man versus person thing?
Well, one big reason was the whole theological debate about resurrection.
Resurrection.
Yeah, like how can someone be resurrected when their body is constantly changing with new cells and all that?
Ah, right. The same matter isn't there throughout a person's life.
Exactly. So Locke's distinction offers a way to solve this. By saying personhood isn't tied to some specific physical or immaterial substance, he can say that the same person could be resurrected in a different body.
As long as that new body has the same consciousness.
Right, the same continuous stream of thoughts and experiences. And he famously uses the thought experiment of the prince and the cobbler to make this point.
Remind me how that goes.
So imagine that the consciousness of a prince is somehow transferred into the body of a cobbler.
Like a Freaky Friday situation.
Exactly. So now you have this being with the cobbler's body but the prince's mind. And Locke says everyone would rightly consider this being to be the same person as the prince.
Because it has all his memories and personality and everything.
Right. And everyone would hold him responsible for the prince's actions. But clearly it's not the same man, the same human animal.
Right, different body, different man.
So the thought experiment suggests that psychological continuity, especially things like memory, those are what really matter for personal identity.
Okay, so Locke is saying personhood, this continuity of consciousness, that's also what grounds moral responsibility.
Yes. He says that we're only responsible for actions that we can remember doing. Because memory connects us to our past selves. It ties us to our past actions as part of a single consciousness.
But what about amnesia? If someone forgets what they did, does that mean they're not responsible?
That's a great question. And Locke actually addresses this. He says that in amnesia, the I, the person who's conscious now, might not be psychologically continuous with the I that did the action in the past.
So there's a break in the stream of consciousness.
Right. So in that sense, the person might not be the same one who committed the act. But the human animal is the same.
So Locke has a way to account for holding people accountable, even if their memories are messed up.
Right. It all comes back to that distinction between man and person.
Okay, so let's recap Locke's key points, the ones that are especially relevant for animalism. First, personhood isn't just being human, it's about being rational and self-aware. Second, being a person is what makes you morally responsible. Third, persons persist through psychological connections, while human animals persist through biological continuity. And fourth, you can have one man who's associated with multiple persons over time, and maybe even persons who exist without being human animals at all.
That's a great summary, and it's against this lock-in background that animalism develops.
So, where do animalists stand on all of this? Do they just completely reject everything Locke said?
No, not entirely. Actually, they agree with Locke on some important points.
Like what?
Well, they often agree with his account of how human animals persist. Remember, we talked about organic and somatic animalism.
Yeah, the two different versions of animalism.
Right. So those views are often compatible with Locke's view of the persistence conditions for the human animal.
Okay, so they don't completely throw out the man. And they also don't rule out the possibility of, like, non-human persons, right?
Like Locke's rational parrot. They leave that door open.
So where do they fundamentally disagree with Locke? What's the big point of contention?
The main disagreement is that animalists reject Locke's claim that person is a sortal concept.
A sortal concept. We talked about that earlier, right? It's like a category of things that can persist over time.
Exactly, like dog or tree. Animalists argue that person isn't like that. It's what's called a phase sortal.
A phase sorter.
Yeah, it's something that applies to a thing for only a phase of its existence. Like, think about being a teenager.
Okay, so I was a teenager, but I'm not one now, and I didn't cease to exist when I stopped being a teenager.
Exactly. And that's how animalists see personhood. They say it's not about what something fundamentally is, it's about what it can do during a certain stage of its existence.
So it's like a status that you can gain and lose, kind of like being asleep or awake.
Right. It's about having certain psychological capacities, like rationality, self-awareness, moral agency, and these are things you develop over time.
So, like, a baby human animal isn't a person yet because it doesn't have those capacities.
Exactly. Olson, one of the main animalists, calls person a functional kind, which means it's defined by what it can do, its function.
Kind of like saying a locomotor is anything that can move itself around, whether it's a human, a car, or an ant.
Perfect analogy.
Mm-hmm.
So a person, for animalists, is any being, human, alien, whatever, that has those particular psychological abilities.
So we become persons at some point, usually around the age of 2, and we can stop being persons too.
Right. Like if you suffer a severe brain injury and end up in a persistent vegetative state, you still be a human animal, but you might no longer be a person.
Okay, so animalism has this very different view of personhood, and this sets up the clash with the other big idea in this area, what we called neo-Lockeanism earlier.
Exactly. Neo-Lockeanism is the main rival to animalism, and it essentially says that Locke was right, that psychological continuity is what really matters for personal identity.
So who are the neo-Lockeans?
Well, there's a whole range of them, and their specific views can differ quite a bit, but they all share this commitment to some form of psychological criterion for personal identity.
Okay, but it's not just a single unified theory.
No, it's more of a family of views. And one key distinction is between those who use this idea of material constitution and those who don't.
Material constitution, that's the statue and marble thing again, right?
Exactly. So constitutionalist neo-Lockeans, those are the ones who say, yes, we're physically realized as animals, but our identity as persons is separate from that.
So I'm co-located with a human animal, but I'm not the same thing as that human animal.
Right. And some of the biggest names in contemporary philosophy fall into this camp, like Baker, Johnston, and Sidney Shoemaker.
Okay, so what are some of the arguments they make?
Well, Sidney Shoemaker, he argues that animals just don't have the right kind of persistence for thought.
What does he mean by that?
He says that genuine thought requires these connections between mental states, like my thought now is causally related to my thought a moment ago. And this kind of causal connection needs a certain kind of persistence, psychological continuity, which he says animals don't have because they're just biological organisms.
So for Shoemaker, we think, but animals don't really think in the same way.
Yeah, that's kind of the idea. He has this thought experiment where he imagines transplanting your cerebrum, the part of your brain responsible for a lot of your mental life, into another body.
Okay, so my cerebrum is moved into a new body.
Right. And he says it seems like you would go with your cerebrum, not stay behind with the rest of your original body. This suggests that your persistence is tied to your psychological continuity, not your biological body.
Okay, that's Shoemaker's argument. What about Baker? She has that first-person perspective argument, right?
Exactly. She says that persons have a first-person perspective, essentially. It's just part of what it means to be a person. But animals, they only have this perspective derivatively because they constitute a person.
So it's like I have a first person perspective because that's just how I am as a person. But the animal only has it because it happens to be me.
Right. She has this key distinction between derivative and non-derivative properties.
Okay, remind me what that means again.
So something has a property derivatively if it only has it because of its relationship to something else. Like the marble has the property of being part of a statue, but only because it's arranged in a certain way to form that statue.
But the statue itself has that property non-derivatively. It just is a statue.
Right. And Baker says that's how it is with persons and animals. The animal only has a weak first-person perspective, but the person has a strong one.
Okay, so those are the constitutionalist neo-Lockeans. What about the ones who don't use material constitution?
They usually end up identifying the person with some specific part of the animal, typically the brain. They say, yeah, the whole biological organism might exist, but the real you, the seat of your consciousness, that's your brain. Or maybe just a specific part of your brain.
So like, I am my hippocampus or something.
Something like that, yeah. And these views often rely on thought experiments involving brain transplants or teletransportation or things like that.
So if you could beam my mind into a new body, they would say I went along with my mind, not my original body.
Exactly. They put a lot of emphasis on psychological continuity as being the key to personal identity.
Okay, so we've got animalism on one side and this whole family of neo-Locking views on the other side. It's starting to feel like a real philosophical battle.
It is. But now let's look at what the animalists have to say in their own defense. What are the main arguments for their position?
Okay, let's hear them.
One of the most intuitive arguments for animalism is what's called the thinking animal argument.
Thinking animal argument. What's that all about?
Well, animalists like Snowden and Olson, they point out that it just seems like common sense that we are animals. Like when you eat, breathe, think, feel, it's a human animal doing all those things. When you look in the mirror, you see a human animal.
It does seem pretty straightforward.
Right. So the thinking animal argument tries to put this common sense intuition into a formal argument.
Okay, how does it go?
So it starts with the premise that there's a human animal sitting right where you are right now.
Okay, that seems pretty safe to assume.
Right. Then the second premise is that that human animal is thinking.
Okay, I'm thinking.
Right. And if we assume that other animals can think too, which most people do, it seems like it would be weird to deny that human animals can think.
Yeah, that seems like special pleading, like we're saying humans are somehow uniquely different.
Exactly. And then the third premise is that you are the thinking being sitting where you are.
Okay, so now the argument is saying that the human animal is thinking, and I am the thinking thing sitting here.
Right. And from that, the conclusion follows. You are the human animal sitting where you are.
So the argument is basically saying, look, there's a thinking animal here, you're the thinking thing here, so you must be the thinking animal.
Exactly. And the argument seems very strong. To deny it, you have to say that there's a thinking human animal here and another thinking being, you who's somehow separate, occupying the same space and thinking the same thoughts.
That does seem like a bit much.
Right. So animalists say the simplest explanation is that you are the animal.
Okay, so that's the thinking animal argument.
Yeah.
But I'm sure philosophers have found ways to object to this.
Well, they have. And their responses often target specific parts of the argument.
Like what?
Well, Baker, with her Constitution view, she challenges that third premise. The one that says you are the thinking being sitting there.
Because she says the person and the animal are the same thing, even though they're made of the same stuff?
Right. She says that phrase, thinking being sitting in your chair, that's ambiguous because you, the person, you're thinking non-derivatively, but the animal is only thinking derivatively because it happens to be you.
Okay, that's pretty subtle. What about other objections?
Well, Harold Noonan, he's got an interesting take. He says there's actually ambiguity in the second and third premises.
The ones about thinking and who's doing the thinking.
Yeah. He says the pronoun I that we use, that only ever refers to persons, not to animals.
So even if the animal is the one doing the thinking, in some sense, I'm still the one thinking because I always picks out the person.
Right. It's a pretty radical revision of how we understand pronouns. And then, of course, there's Sidney Shoemaker. He challenges the second premise, the one that says the human animal is thinking.
Right, because he thinks animals don't really think in the same way we do.
Exactly. He says that the human animal might be doing the biological work of thinking, but the real thinking, the kind that involves genuine psychological continuity, that's done by the person.
Okay, so those are some objections to specific parts of the argument. Are there any that attack the whole thing, like the structure of the argument itself.
Yeah, there's one called the rival candidates problem, raised by Zimmerman. He says, look, if the reason you think there's a human animal sitting there is just because there's some biological matter arranged in a certain way, well, couldn't you say the same thing about a slightly smaller collection of matter?
Like my body minus a finger or something.
Exactly. Or what about just my head or my brain?
So he's saying the argument doesn't tell us why we should identify with the whole human animal rather than some part of it.
Right. And then there's the thinking parts problem, which pushes this even further.
How so?
Well, it says even if we grant that there's some thinking being sitting there, why does it have to be the whole animal? Why not just the head or the brain, since those are also thinking parts?
So you could make the same kind of argument for each of those parts, and then you'd end up saying, I'm identical to all sorts of different things.
Exactly, which seems pretty absurd.
It does. So how do animalists respond to all of this?
Well, there are a lot of different responses, and they often depend on other philosophical commitments. Like Beninwagen, for example. He has this very specific view of what it means to be a composite object.
Composite, like made up of parts.
Right. He says that only living organisms can be genuine composite objects.
So like a table isn't really a composite object, even though it's made of legs and a top.
Right. And this dissolves the problem of rival candidates because it means those other things, like your body minus a finger, those aren't really distinct things in the relevant sense.
Okay, so Van Inwagen has a solution, but it relies on accepting his whole other theory of what things exist.
Exactly.
So